Welcome, Sexplorers, to another episode 7 here of Sexplorations with me, your host, AdelinaAdler. Now, for today's episode, I figured we'd take a stab at a listener email here, and this one comes from a listener who spent some time in the sex work industry. It reads, "Good morning. So my question stems from experiences I'm seeing with myself, as well as some friends from my dancing days. In the beginning of most relationships, it's usually sparks flying, sexual energy and tension are high, and usually that is when we are our most romantic selves. But as time goes by and the newness of the relationship fades, we tend to settle into a routine where sex is more of a special occasion or just not as frequent as it was in the beginning. My friend and I were talking about his newer relationship and how his partner was upset because he wasn't pursuing her sexually as much as she wanted. And as I listened, I couldn't help but draw connections to my own life and occasional issue with my fiance, which is that I too am not as sexually charged as my partner. Now, my friend worked for years in a strip club and was used to seeing naked women, and he grew not only accustomed to seeing female nudity on a daily basis, but numb to it as well. His partner was upset that she walks around the house naked, but he pays her no mind. We both said the same thing, which was, when you do sex work for a job so long, it really messes with your idea of intimacy on a sexual level. So when you get off of work and you come home, the last thing you want to do is more work, and in our heads, sex is now considered work. We laughed at how we said we forced ourselves into being intimate with our partners to keep them happy, but truthfully, it's really sad to know we can't enjoy sex for what it is anymore. I've spoken to my fiance and tried to explain it to him that sex is not special to me anymore, but intimacy is still important. My version of intimacy is more like mental, though. Spending time together and talking and just being present with one another is the intimacy I crave, and my friend agreed. So my question is, do you think that when it comes to sex workers or people that have worked in the sex work environment, that we crave different attention and intimacy versus your average non-sex working partners? Or are we just the oddballs out here? If so, what is some advice you can give to help us non-sexual romantics out there? We're really trying our best. Oh, thank you so much for submitting that, buddy. As some of you listening may know, I've been a sex worker for a little over 10 years now, and I can say that I too have experienced similar feelings such as this listener has described. So this question was of particular interest to me, and hopefully it's helpful and interesting to some of you out there too, because it really does deal with issues about desire discrepancy and mismatched libidos and such. Now, there are a few things happening here in this email. First concern mentioned is a common one, the fading or mismatched attraction that happens here. Now, in the beginning, she does talk about the sensation of what I call limerence, which limerence on a basic definition is the state of being infatuated or obsessed with another person, because they're new and exciting and you want them to like you too. It's a period characterized by a strong desire of reciprocation of one's feelings. Not necessarily sexual by definition, but like in romantic relationships, this certainly can apply. A big thing in that is the idea of novelty. So the first time we experience nearly any somatic delight, it hits us on a different level. Just ask your buddy who has dabbled in a few, chemical party favors, which is an apt metaphor because, similar things are going on neurologically there. If you remember our talk about Emily Nagoski, she mentions those dopaminergic systems and opioid hotspots from the liking and wanting regions contained in that reward center of the brain. Well, to put it in the plainest terms, the novel stimuli are activating all these sparks and juices, making your pupils dilate and all of that, making your body feel ecstatic. But like that party buddy might also tell you, with enough exposure, the body's experiences plateau, and eventually it balances itself out to baseline. And that's why it takes more drugs, to reach the same desired effect. It's called building a tolerance, and a similar thing can happen in our relationships, and in turn, it affects our libidos. Now, this is perfectly normal, and a great deal of sex coaches' work is dedicated to helping people rekindle that lost sense of libido. And coaches Celeste and Danielle at the Somatica Institute refer to this as desire discrepancy, which refers not just to mismatched libidos, but partners who are also trying to have different kinds of sex. Because, there are different kinds. So if your ears perked up and you're like, oh, there's different kinds of sex. Yeah, there is. And don't worry, we'll get to that later. They also explain that during this initial limerence phase, couples usually are willing to put up with having their erotic or emotional erotic needs skirted or put aside for the sake of their partner, because for now, that novelty is enough to suffice in place of those needs. The need right now being met is that rush that comes with that novelty and that newness. Your body is responding just fine to that, so you're willing to kind of, put the other stuff on the back burner. But once that phase ends, if we haven't quite expressed our desires and needs up to that point, those might get cast to the wayside still. And in turn, if you're not getting much out of the experience of sex, then you're not going to want to be as eager to participate. And a lot of times, a lot of us don't even recognize what exactly it is we desire. We don't know how to pinpoint it, how to express it. Once we do find it, we might feel apprehensive talking about it because we don't want to offend our partners or anything like that. And a lot of times, especially I find this with women, we find ourselves as wanting to be kind to our hosts. We tend to be the yielders in that kind of experience. And a lot of work comes in reframing that as, hey, this experience is also for you. Just because you're having a good time doesn't mean your partner is not going to have a good time. And the neglect of need doesn't happen on purpose either. We tend to project what turns us onto the other person. And since we're all built differently, of course, that's not always going to work out well. Meanwhile, showing versus telling sometimes doesn't work for correcting these misassumptions. So your partner might not be picking up when you're kind of moving their hand to a certain place more often than not. The best thing you can do, and what we try to teach as sex coaches, is to get you comfortable with telling partners what turns you on, word by word, touch by touch, and how you want it given to you. And meanwhile, we celebrate each other's desires and respect each other's boundaries while doing so. Unfortunately, in cases of mismatched libidos, we can see partners getting upset and offended when their mates don't reciprocate sexual advances. I mean, it makes sense. They feel rejected, and nobody likes that. There's usually feelings of shame and insecurity due to self-value assessments. Like, am I not enough? Don't you want me? Baby? Oh, is there someone else? As a result, some partners may begin to shame or coerce one another and blame each other. Don't you care about my needs? Or even without manipulation, one partner might find themselves yielding and forcing themselves to sexually comply just to appease the other's needs. And we see that actually expressed by the listener here. Obligation sex. And none of these behaviors and thought processes are conducive for a healthy, empowered sex life, especially in the long term. It's important also to understand here that this is nobody's fault. Again, this happens to a lot of us. So we're going to remove the blame from either party here right off the bat. And we're going to put on our cooperation caps. See how we can move forward together. Remember that. Cooperation versus compromise. So we're going to start by exploring the why behind what's going on here first in this episode. And then in part 2, because I did have to split this up, we're going to take a look at ways that we might reframe our perspectives and come together and find solutions, and that maybe help us to come together. Now, for this episode, I'm going to focus on another social element at play here, because we are dealing with sex workers and people in the sex work industry, particularly here with exotic dancers and those who work within the culture of gentlemen's clubs. Overall, there is a certain expectation for sex workers to be sexual beings all of the time. People can become infatuated with the idea of what they see portrayed on the stage or in film, and then make the assumption that what they're seeing is, well, us. And to a certain extent, it is. We're not being disingenuous in our expression of sexuality, but to assume that it's what you're gonna get in the intimate comfort of your home in reality is a little off the mark. See, our job is to embody a certain marketable idea of what sex is. A caricature, if you will, of desire, seduction, and allure. This portrayal is based off of what our society sees as sexy, and with our added personal spice, we embody these sort of sexual avatars in hopes of attracting payment. Dollar bills, y'all. Now, I like using food metaphors since food is something universal we can all understand, right? So let's imagine that sex is a genre of cuisine. Yes, sex workers, in this case, exotic dancers, use their unique blends of herbs, spices, and ingredients to create delicious-looking, mouth-watering dishes in hopes of attracting patrons who might, want a little taste. It is a little more personal though, because they themselves, the sex workers, are the dish. So remember, while something you make is personal to you, we are the product. So there is a certain amount of attachment there to it. And now on top of that, imagine that someone in an I Heart McDonald's shirt snubs your 5-star home-cooked meal with all the assumed self-importance of Gordon Ramsay and insists they shouldn't have to pay for a meal, even though they're sitting at a restaurant. Yeah. Now imagine that happens about 80% of the time throughout your night. People always look at me funny when I tell them that so much of dancing is getting rejected over and over again. But it really is. That's the reality of it. And it's obnoxious. And it's incredibly taxing. Like any service industry job, sex work can be extremely taxing. In fact, I think it's one of the most taxing industry jobs out there, and it's often overlooked and underestimated. But while these are caricatures of sexuality, the people embodying them are very real, and the expressions of this sexuality are very much theirs. So while sex work can be an incredibly empowering and uplifting and fulfilling work, it's also a job that demands one develop a thick skin and a certain detachment from that part of our sexual identity. So still using this food metaphor, then what you get is a chef who comes home after a demanding day of cooking and shitty critics and doesn't want to cook. Cooking has become a chore. Cooking is tied to those stress-inducing experiences of negotiating one's value to strangers over and over again. It has become synonymous with labor, struggle, toil, emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. Meanwhile, their partner may feel slightly slighted because when they enter this relationship with a chef, for better or worse, they were expecting 4-course meals. They had that sexpectation. What has happened here is that cooking, rather, sex, and sexually adjacent activities have become removed from their connotative ties with pleasure and desire, at least in the ways we often recognize them. They have instead become reframed in the mind of the sex worker. The same can be seen for the listener's friend for whom, after being exposed to the sight of naked women behaving erotically night after night in the context of a job, the stimulus code switched. Remember that we give things meaning. The sight of a naked person isn't by nature inherently sexual. We place the label of sexual on it according to the context. Even in the case of seeing naked women behaving sexually, because it is done within the context of work, the connotation code switches to fit that context often enough, and so it becomes the dominant connotation. You dig? That's why his girlfriend walking around naked in front of him doesn't elicit the same response as it would from a person outside of the sex industry. It has nothing to do with the girlfriend. She could be the hottest woman in the world, but because the connotation of that stimuli has changed, her walking around isn't a sexually charged thing for him. Similarly, back when I did the naked booth, I used to get this question a lot from men outside the industry. They'd ask if I ever got turned on while dancing. And my answer to this question went, yeah, sometimes, but not for the reasons you might assume. It wasn't the customer I was dancing for that was doing it for me, or necessarily even what I was doing that was turning me on. Even though, like we discussed in the arousal non-concordance episode, certain physical stimulations will yield reactions. More so, I would be turned on by the idea of how hot I was, or, their attraction to me. I was getting off on them being so hot for me. Or the fantasy that I was a sex priestess doing the work of a Nana Ishtar at a temple. Basically, I was playing with fantasy modalities in my mind that made the situation fun for me. But on dances that I wasn't doing that, I was still presenting as sexual and doing sexual movements, gestures, and things, but I wasn't aroused at all. I was just doing a job. Many other dancers describe similar experiences. We're pantomiming sexy things without feeling sexy about them in the conventional ways. That code for us is switched. Thus, to us, sex and sexual fulfillment no longer necessarily look like what we're doing at work. And because sex isn't inherently tied to intimacy to begin with, we tend then to especially value the expression of intimacy in other forms when available, and sex then takes a backseat in our personal lives. It's just not that important to us because, we don't see it the same way others do, especially when you're oversaturated in it. So to answer part of the listener's question, that is certainly the case with many sex workers, though, of course, we can't speak for all of us. However, it is not something exclusive to sex workers. As we touched on before, desire discrepancy is a concern that many relationships struggle with and seek help for. The preference of romantic intimacy versus sexual intimacy is also something not exclusive to sex workers. Just ask your friendly neighborhood asexual. Or, many sexually active men and women as well in general. Because while sex workers are probably more likely to experience this because of their environment, they are certainly not alone. So while we may get to that island on different boats, we're certainly there together and in good company. And I do tend to find that after we stop doing sex work in that regard, that does change a little bit. Our sexual appetites do go up again. Once you stop doing something for the labor of it, it can become a little more enjoyable. Again, that context, that connotation gets removed, and it's a little easier to replace that with, our other connotations that fit and meet our erotic emotional needs. But we're definitely going to talk about that a little more in part 2. Now, if you guys have similar experiences out there, whether you are a sex worker or not, and maybe if you're a sex worker in another industry, definitely shoot me an email, let me know, put a comment up on YouTube or find us on Facebook and put it out there, because after all, part of eliminating shame and becoming empowered again is knowing we're not alone. It's building that community and nurturing spaces of empathy, because shame cannot exist where empathy lies. And in order to, know that we're not the oddballs out here, it's good to know that, hey, yeah, no, this is a common thing. And better yet, there are strategies that we can implement to work with it and still feel fulfilled. And I definitely don't want to get the impression that you have to be sexual in order to be intimate. But I definitely also don't want you to completely rule it out just because you're not necessarily given the tools to try to find a different way in. If you do find yourself like, I can be sexual, I just don't have the energy to do it or the want to do it at home outside of work. And again, this is something that sex workers specifically deal with as well. I want to give us a tool for that, because when I experienced it, I definitely found ways around it, and it had to do with reframing and finding the story in my mind that fit and met my emotional needs, or the needs that I had at the time. It was finding a sexy story that literally hit that nub. And it's bizarre, it's weird sometimes, because it had nothing to do with anything overtly sexual sometimes. Like it was like I got turned on by the idea that my partner was just so darn sweet and attentive, and I was like, look at this man right here being so goddamn nice. I'm gonna do some things and diddle his dongle. or during the sex, like that was that was the idea I was clinging on to, and it turned me on, because I guess at that time that was a need I really wanted met intimately. So that intimacy story was what I used to basically nurture that physiological feeling of sex. Because remember, sex is largely between the ears. It goes on between the ears, like Dr. Ruth said. It's in your head, it's in your mind. So we're going to work on finding strategies to not only identify what those desires are, get a solid look at them, and then get comfortable with presenting them, and how we can talk to our partners about this. And we also want to talk about these different kinds of sex that I was alluding to at the beginning of the episode, because there are different ways of performing sex or approaching sex that do have certain expressions behind them that can help solidify or fulfill those desire fantasies in our minds as well. A lot of good stuff. I did want to do further research on this one, which is why I'm cutting it short here, just to get a broader idea, a few more perspectives on this for you guys. I hope you will tune in to next week, and I hope today helped you understand a little bit of background on this situation, particularly from the point of view of sex workers. If you have any questions about sex work or the industry, about sex in general, you already know, or if you have any comments about that scenario from earlier, go ahead and shoot me an email at askAddieAdler@gmail.com and let me know what you think, guys. Again, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Thank you to all my patrons who are always giving me such great support. I just got another wave of submissions here, so that brings us $100 closer to our $1,500 goal. As soon as I hit $1,500, I will be signing up for those Somatica classes, because I'm going to tell you, I did look up their videos on their YouTube for this one, and they did a good job. They teased me with it. They were like, aha, there are solutions. Here you go. But you're going to have to wait for it, just like I'm doing to you a little bit right now. But it's going to be essential to get some more of those strategies through that education. Well, it's all right, guys, because I'm also going to be doing the hard work over here, reading and listening to hours and hours of audiobooks for you on the background. I did just go to Baltimore and visited Sugar up there, a delightful sex shop, and I picked up some great reading material, as well as took pictures of a whole lot of other good awesome books that I'm going to need to look up. I'm going to try to get it from their website too, because, support local business. I put their information on the website, on the Facebook, so you guys can check them out too and give them some support, show them some love. But yes, getting back to the ones showing me some love, thank you to my patrons Devin, Tyler, Chris Elliott, RD Hannah, Emily Sievert, and our one-time donors Natty Sunshine and her friend up in Germany, as well as Papa Bruce. Y'all mean the world to me. If you would like to become a patron, go ahead and find me on Patreon/Explorations, or if you want to be a one-time donor, you can go ahead and cash at me at AdelinaAdler, or you can PayPal me also at me.paypal/AdelinaAdler. Some of these links are also available on the Facebook page for Sexplorations, so just look me up and you can find how you can help there too. If not, spreading the word is always excellent. Participation is also super important, guys. Give me some feedback, have some discussions with me, with each other, to create this community, because again, this is all about creating a sexually empowered community. Thanks again, everybody, and hopefully I'll see you next time. As you notice, again, we're not doing the stream thing. It's gonna be these kinds of uploads every week. If it's not Thursday, it's gonna be Friday, so look out for it. Thank you so much, guys, and until next time, stay so sexy.